Last time we finished up the Sino-French War of 1884 to 1885. Yet before we even commenced with all that, we were talking about the situation in Korea. We had last spoken about the Gapsin coup. Li Hangzhang had snipped the bud of war before it could bloom after the Imo uprising, and the Daewongun stole back power in Korea. The Daewongun was spanked, and he was sent into exile yet again, but now Korea had become greatly factionalized. The progressives and conservatives were fighting bitterly to set Korea on a Japanese or Chinese path to modernization. This led radicals like Kim Ok-keun to perform the Gapsin coup, which was terribly planned and failed spectacularly. Japan and China were yet again tossed into a conflict in Korea, but China firmly won the day, for she had more forces to bear. Japan licked her wounds and went home, learning a bitter lesson. That lesson was, next time, bring more friends to the party. This episode is the assassination of Kim Ok-keun and the Donghak Rebellion. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Maybe you really prefer visuals? Well, over on my personal channel, I have a 2-part series on the First Sino-Japanese War. Also, just a friendly reminder, I myself now have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And this month's exclusive podcast is my part 2 on my series about General Kanji Ishiwara, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident and the author behind the Final War Theory. Check it out, it would mean a lot to me. Now, despite the Gapsin coup, Japan and China still tried to cooperate against the West. But Japan was learning much from the outside world, particularly by the actions of imperialistic nations. Britain had begun large-scale operations in Shanghai, developing the international settlement there. King Leopold of Belgium established the Congo Free State of 1862, and likewise France and Britain were also establishing colonies all over Africa. The Dutch held Java, and then invaded Sumatra in 1873 and other parts of Indonesia after that. The Russians were taking large swaths of land, including Vladivostok, Khabarovsk, and parts of the Sakhalin. Even territory close to Korea in the region of Pramur. Once the ports of Wonsan and Ikon were opened up, Japanese manufactured goods began to pour in. By 1893, 91% of imports into Korea would be from Japan, while 8% would be coming from China. While China tried to keep Japan out, the Meiji Restoration had created an industrial powerhouse that made goods, and China had not managed this herself. At that point, Korean trade went 49% over to China and 50% over to Japan. In the eyes of Koreans, even though she was not formally a colony of Japan, the way the Japanese were behaving looked pretty imperialistic. Now in 1886, the Beiyang fleet was responsible for protecting China's northern coastline, and she would make a fateful call to Nagasaki. The purpose of this call was to show off her brand new 4 modern battleships that she had purchased from Germany. These were the Dingyuan, Jianyuan, Jiyuan, and Weiyuan. These ships were far larger than anything Japan had at the time. A large reason because Japan was following the Je ne sais naval strategy. This strategy was developed by France to basically combat the British Royal Navy. It emphasized using small, rapid assault craft, cruisers and destroyers for example, to thwart the might of capital ships like battleships. For my fellow World of Warship players out there, the idea was simple. Instead of slamming a shit ton of money into large battleships to fight other large battleships, the French began to experiment more with the capability of torpedo technology. With faster, smaller ships, the French thought that they could be used more like raiders, to attack the enemy and cripple them. The Jeune École doctrine also sought to use strongly armed, fast ships. Thus, it's kind of like a glass cannon situation. Anyways, the implicit message from China was to show Japan how foolish they would be if they went to war with her. On August the 13th, 500 Chinese sailors took a shore leave in Nagasaki. They went to the local red light district. As you can imagine, one thing led to another, and some altercations began with the locals. The locals claimed the Chinese sailors got drunk and started causing havoc. Regardless, the Chinese sailors began fighting some Japanese cops, apparently using swords they had bought at some of the stores. One source I found says over 80 people died during this, which is pretty nuts since it was just kind of a barroom brawl. The next day, a conference was held by the governor of Nagasaki, Kusaki Yoshio, and the Qing consulate, Xuanzai, which led to an agreement the Beiyang Navy would prohibit their men from going ashore for a day. Then on August the 15th at 1 p.m., 300 Chinese sailors went ashore, some wielding clubs apparently, and they attacked 3 police officers, killing 1. A rickshaw saw the conflict and tried to punch a Chinese sailor, and this all snowballed into a straight-up riot. More cops showed up, more fighting, and this led to the deaths of 2 more cops, 3 sailors, and more than 50 civilians wounded. It was a real shit show, and the Qing decided not to apologize for the entire ordeal. In fact, the Qing made demands to the Chinese government that from then on, Japanese cops would not prohibit Chinese from wielding swords, and force the Japanese to make a large sum of reparation payments. Now, aside from the drunken debauchery, which in the grand scheme of things was not much of a deal, the real deal was the Japanese reaction to the Beiyang fleet. When the Japanese saw the Ding Yuan, they basically went 100% in on the Jeune d'École doctrine to counter it. The IJN immediately decided to construct 3 large cruisers with firepower identical to the Ding Yuan. Basically, this meant they were making battleship killers. While Japan was aggressively modernizing and pouring a ton of money into their navy by the late 1880s, in China, the reconstruction of the Summer Palace was taking enormous sums of funding. The Marble Boat Pavilion, as I have mentioned in the past, was taking funds intended for the Beiyang fleet, thanks to Empress Dowager Cixi, and thus no major investments would be made for the Qing Navy in the last 1880s and early 1890s. To give more of an idea, 1/10 of the salaries for civil officials and military officers in Japan was being deducted to add additional funding for the construction of naval ships and the purchase of arms. Japan was simply not messing around. Now, something that often goes more unnoticed is Japan's early efforts at gaining intelligence on China. Despite the Sino-Japanese relations falling apart because of the Korea situation, trade between China and Japan was growing rapidly in the 1880s. Japanese businessmen expected trade with China to only increase, and in preparation for the expansion, they began collecting information on Chinese market opportunities. Now, for those of you who are not so familiar with Meiji-era Japan, the Zaibatsu-driven system meant private business went hand in hand with the government of Japan, and this led the Japanese government to ask the businessmen to look at other things in China. What sort of things? Military installations, military dockyards, everything military. In 1879, Katsuro Taro took a trip to China with 10 Japanese observers to survey Chinese military facilities. He would publish a book describing Chinese military bases, weapons, and organization in 1881, and that book would be revised in 1882 and 1889. By the time 1894 rolled around, the Japanese military had access to detailed information about China's geography, her economy, her railways, roads, ports, installations, the whole shebang, thanks to Japanese journalists and businessmen. And I'd like to take just a little side note here from my script that I'd written, because I think I had failed to mention something that's actually interesting about the situation. At this point in history, when the Japanese businessmen are performing business, to be honest, that is actually all that they were intending to do, and doing these surveys of certain areas of Manchuria, Well, Chinese historians and Japanese historians have a very differing take on what's going on. Japanese sources will tell you, initially, the businessmen were honest businessmen. They were just doing market research. And honestly, I believe that, initially at least. But the Japanese government, with their reins over the Zaibatsu, did indeed get them to start, well, more or less, we'll call it spying on the Chinese military. Now, Chinese historians, a lot of them will tell you this is the basis for the entire conflict between the nations, and I'm talking until World War II. Many Chinese historians outline Japan is at this time creating a doctrine to invade and take all of China, and that this is the very basis of that. Some say that this goes back actually even further. In all honesty, Chinese historians have a lot of theories as to when they believe Japan had formally made its decision to invade China and take it all for themselves. Now, it is true, Japan does indeed create a doctrine to take most of Asia. But did it occur in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s? That is kind of hard to prove. Japan did indeed have plans to take Manchuria, though, very early on. But for China proper, as it would be called, that's a little hard to prove. Anyways, I just wanted to bring this up because it is quite a contentious argument between Japanese and Chinese historians. Now, amongst those businessmen and journalists, of course, there were full-blown Japanese spies. But for the most part, China did not do enough due diligence to hide its military capabilities. Rather ironically, the Japanese businessmen who opposed military actions and just wanted to help develop China contributed a lot of information that would in turn hurt China. On the other side of the coin, Chinese reports about Japan were a complete 180. China's Consul General in Nagasaki wrote reports on the ships coming and going within Nagasaki harbor. Alongside him, the Chinese ambassador to Tokyo, Li Shuchang, who served from 1881 to 1884 and then again in 1887 to 1890, sent some warnings about developments in Korea. Other than those two, Japan attracted virtually no interest from Beijing. Just before the war would break out in 1894, the Chinese ambassador to Tokyo, Wang Fengtao, reported to Beijing that the Japanese were so obsessed with internal politics they were unlikely to be active externally. I think it's interesting to point out, while Japan was indeed building up the IJA and the IGN, she never stopped pointing that gun at Russia. China and Japan, right up to the conflict we will be talking about, had its tensions, its conflicts, its escalations, but they never gave up the chance to cooperate against the West. Take a legendary figure like Yamagata Aritomo, who led the development of the IJA and was the head of the Japanese Privy Council. In 1893, he publicly stated Japan should cooperate with China against their main enemies, Russia, France, and Britain. Despite all the tensions in Korea, vast amounts of Japanese and Chinese scholars who studied the causes of the First Sino-Japanese War came to agree it would not have occurred if not for two key events. The first one is an assassination, and the second is a rebellion. In early 1894, Kim Ok-keun was invited to visit Li Hangjiang in Shanghai. After living nearly a decade in fear of assassination, he accepted the invitation, perhaps believing this was his only chance to reclaim normality in his life. Well, unbeknownst to him, another Korean acquaintance of his named Hong Jong Yu had actually gone to Japan in 1893 trying to hunt him down, and he found out about the voyage. One source claims Hong Jong Yu was working for King Gojong and went to Japan befriending him, while trying to lure him back over to Shanghai. Regardless, Hong Jong Yu got aboard, and he murdered Kim Ok-keun by shooting him on March the 27th. Hong Jong Yu was arrested by British authorities in Shanghai for his crime. But in accordance with their treaty obligations, they surrendered the assassin over to Qing authorities for trial. The Qing instead freed him, whereupon he became quite the celebrity for his actions. Hong Jong Yu would return to Korea and would be appointed to a high office position, giving credence to the theory he was working for King Gojong the entire time. When Kim Ok-keun's body arrived to Korea, it was shrouded in some cloth bearing the inscription, Ok-keun, arch-rebel and heretic. On April the 14th, Kim Gojong ordered the body decapitated, so the head could be displayed in Seoul while 8 other body parts would be sent to each of Korea's 8 provinces to be showcased likewise. His severed body parts were showcased in various cities in Korea to display what happens to those who commit treason. Kim Ok-keun's father was hanged, and his brother, wife, and daughter were all imprisoned. You see, under Korean practice at the time, it was common for the family of the guilty to be punished as well. And that's some pretty hardcore stuff there, folks. The wife and daughter would become slaves to government offices, a standard punishment for the female household members of rebels. It was during this time one of Kim Ok-keun's traveling companions, a Chinese linguist for the location in Tokyo, claimed to reporters that Kim Ok-keun had come to Shanghai by invitation from Lord Li Jingfang, the former minister at Tokyo and adopted son of Li Hangjiang. Well, the Japanese public were outraged. Japanese newspapers interpreted all of this to mean Viceroy Li Hangjiang had planned the whole damn thing. It was also alleged Li Hangjiang had sent a congratulatory telegram to the Korean government for the assassination. Many others pointed towards Kim Gojong, since the assassin claimed to be under direct orders from the king. Kim Ok-keun had been a guest in Japan, and the Qing authorities had seemingly done nothing to protect him, and they made no attempt to bring the assassin to justice. The Qing had likewise handed over the corpse, knowing full well what the Koreans would do to it, as was their custom for treason. From the Japanese point of view, the Qing had gone out of their way to insult the Japanese in every possible manner. From the Chinese point of view, Kim Ok-keun had committed high treason and deserved his fate. Fukazawa Yukichi led a funeral ceremony held in Tokyo at Aoyama Cemetery for Kim Ok-keun. He had taught the man, and spoke in his honor, reflecting Japan's respect for his efforts to modernize Korea. The Japanese press began to fill with public calls for a strong national response. The Chinese reaction during this time period reflected their deep-seated prejudices concerning the Japanese. Even with official communications, the Qing routinely referred to the Japanese as Walren, which is a racist term meaning Japanese dwarf, basically. And as a Chinese friend of mine put it, do not say this to Japanese today. Wo is a word for dwarf, and the link to the Japanese was a racial term that emerged during the times the Japanese were pirating the waters around China's coast, the famous Wokou. During the upcoming war, a Qing official expressed these types of racial attitudes. Take this for example. It took them 48,000 years before they made contact with China, while in 3,600 years they still have not accepted our celestial calendar, illegitimately assuming the reign title of Meiji. They in reality abandoned themselves all the more to debauchery and indolence. Falsely calling their new administration a reformation, they only defile themselves so much the more. One Captain William M. Lang, a British officer who helped train the Beiyang Squadron of the Qing fleet from 1881 to 1890, had noted this about the Chinese and Japanese. They treated Japan with the utmost contempt, and Japan, for her part, has the same feeling towards China. One German military advisor in China had this to say. The Chinese looked upon Japan as a traitor towards Asia. Thus, before the war broke out, the Chinese, for the most part, considered the Japanese to be an inferior neighboring people, below the status of tributary, since Japan had severed that link to China. The more tense the situation got between the two nations saw the Chinese viewing the Japanese with much more contempt. They would ridicule the Japanese for their communal bathing habits, the attire of their women, and the way they imitated Western culture. The Japanese, as you might guess, resented this quite a lot. In 1891, Alexander III issued a special imperial rescript announcing Russia's intention to build a Trans-Siberian Railway. From the Japanese point of view, this amounted to a foreign policy manifesto equivalent to the Monroe Doctrine of the United States. Just as America had kicked out all other powers from the Americas, so too it seemed was Russia going to do with the Asian mainland. For the great Meiji leadership of Japan, it looked like Russia would seize control over Korea and thwart Japan's dreams of empire, and the ever-coveted status of great power that came with it. Once the Trans-Siberian Railway was announced, the Japanese knew they had roughly a decade to resolve the Korea situation before the balance of power would be irrevocably changed and the door would be shut upon them. Yet as bad as the situation was for Japan, it was significantly worse for China. The Trans-Siberian Railway would allow the Russians to deploy troops along the Chinese border in areas that would prove quite difficult for the Chinese to do the same thing, as they didn't have any major railways. On top of this, Japan was pursuing an increasingly aggressive foreign policy focused on the Korean peninsula. Qing strategists had long considered Korea an essential buffer for their defenses. With the Russians pushing from the west and the Japanese from the east, Li Hongzhang was hard-pressed to take a more aggressive stance in Korea. Now, as I said, there were two major reasons that were attributed to the outbreak of the First Sino-Japanese War, the first being the assassination of Kim Ok-keun. The second is known as the Donghak Rebellion. Now, I didn't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but the Donghak movement began around 1860 as sort of a religion, emphasizing salvation and providing rituals to achieve this. It was much akin to the Taiping Rebellion, a sect that was deeply upset with their corrupt government. It was formed by a poor member of the Yangbang class, whose father had been a local village scholar, and it was largely created to give hope to the poor class. It had some Roman Catholicism and Western learning associated with it. Again, it was very much like the Taiping. The peasantry class of Korea found this sect very appealing, and the Donghak influence was particularly strong in Cholla province, the breadbasket of Korea. Members of the sect were angry that corrupt Joseon officials in Seoul were imposing high taxes upon them. The leaders of the sect were all poor peasants who, because of their inability to pay their taxes, had either lost their land or were about to lose their land. Their leader was Cho-ju, who described the founding of the Donghak religion as such. By 1860, I heard rumors that the people of the West worship God, and caring not for wealth, conquer the world, building temples and spreading their faith. I was wondering whether I, too, could do such a thing. On an April day, my mind was unnerved and my body trembled. Suddenly, a voice could be heard. I rose and asked who it was. Do not fear, nor be scared. The people of the world call me Hanulim. How do you not know me? Said Hanul. I asked the reason he had appeared to me. I made you in this world so that you could teach my holy word to the people. Do not doubt my word, Hanulim replied. Do you seek to teach the people with Christianity? I asked again. No, I have a magical talisman. Use this talisman and save the people from disease, and use this book to teach the people to venerate me. The Joseon dynasty quickly banned the religion and executed its leaders in 1864 for, quote, tricking and lying to the foolish people. Regardless, the Donghak spread across Gyeongsang province by the 1870s under new leadership. However, in the 1870s, the rice agriculture in Korea had become increasingly commercialized as Japanese merchants bought more and more of it to ship back over to Japan. Korea was not producing enough to meet the needs of its own population as a result. Japanese merchants would begin to lend money to local Korean peasants, and when the peasants could not repay the funds, the rice merchants confiscated their land. This obviously was seen as dishonest and exploitative, and it 100% was. The Donghak gradually became very anti-Japanese as a result. The Donghaks performed a series of lesser rebellions against excessive taxation. There were major revolts in 1885, 1888, 1889, 1890, 1891, 1892, and 1893. By the 1890s, the Donghaks began a petition to overturn the 1863 execution of Cho-ju, to stop the ban on all of them, to expel all Western missionaries and merchants, and to kill corrupt officials. It was a tall order. So yeah, Kim Ok-keun did not want to give in to such reasonable petitions, and he told them, quote, "Go to your home. If you do, I may grant your plea." Sounds an awful lot like the leader of a certain French country in the world right now. And yes, those are shots fired. Many of the Donghak wanted to march on Seoul, and they began threatening Westerners and Japanese around them. Soon, a group of over 80,000 Donghak believers, led by a southern leader named Jeon Bong-jin, began marching with flags stating, "Expel the Westerners and Japanese." I just want to take a little side note again here, forgive me. My knowledge of Korean history was almost non-existent until quite recently. I've taken some time to actually learn quite a bit about the history of the Joseon dynasty, but I was particularly interested in the experience of Koreans in the 19th century. And I can most definitely say, Korea is a very, very interesting place, and the history behind them it's fascinating when you're thinking about the greater history of China and Japan and how it changes all three nations. Korea is not just stuck in the middle, it's literally molded by so many forces at play. And the extreme efforts of some Korean officials by the end of the 19th century to try and get Russia or the United States to help them against Japan and China, well, it's so fascinating, there's quite a lot of TV dramas made about it. And they're actually pretty good, I did watch one. I believe the best one I saw was called something like Mr. Sunshine. Weird title, but it was a good show. Now, this isn't a shameless plug, it's just for those of you who are actually interested in this time period, but also the experience of Koreans when they get, for lack of better words, colonized by the Japanese. Over on my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel, as part of Project Ukraine, I made a piece comparing the experience of Korea under Japan to that of Ukraine under the USSR. So this covers basically the late half of the 19th century up to about World War II for both the nations. And they do make for a good comparison because both underwent similar experiences with their languages being put down, their culture being, well, attempted to be destroyed and such. It's quite a good episode. I put a lot of work into it back in the day, and I was really happy to be part of that project. And it also allowed me to do something that was outside of Asia for once, and I got to learn a lot about the history of Ukraine. I don't know if I say it much here, but I'm quite a scholar on World War II in general, and particularly for the Eastern Front. That's probably one of my favorite theaters of World War II. I hope one day I'll get to do more pieces on that. Anyways, back to the story. Now, this is a really confusing and large-scale event. One of, if not the biggest rebellions in Korean history. But one thing to focus on is the particularly oppressive county magistrate named Jo Bayungap in northern Chola. He seemed to have provided the, quote, straw that broke the camel's back, as we say in English. This magistrate had forced young men to work on a water reservoir, and then he charged them and their families for the use of the water. He overly taxed, he fined peasants for dubious crimes, including infidelity, lack of harmony, adultery, and needless talents. I have no idea how that last one works out. He also sent spoiled rice sacks to Seoul while keeping unspoiled sacks for himself. Basically, this guy was an embezzling scumbag. By today's standards, we would refer to him as a member of the United States Congress. By March the 22nd, tens of thousands of Donghak rebels destroyed the new reservoir. They burnt down the governmental offices and some storage facilities in northern Chola. Then they occupied Taein by April the 1st, and a few days later, Buan. The local Joseon government sent Commander Lee Young-gyo with 700 soldiers and 600 merchants to try and quell the rebellion, only to be lured into an ambush at the Hwangto Pass. Many of the troops were killed, some deserted, and the Donghak Rebellion spread further north. Kim Ok-keun panicked, because news spread the rebels were being joined not only by countryside peasants, but by many of his soldiers as well. Worried that the Joseon military would not be able to quell the rebellion, Kim Ok-keun called upon his Qing allies to send reinforcements. Now, there are two narratives that come into play here. The first involved the Qing responding quickly, on June the 7th following the Tianjin Treaty's requirements that if one country sent troops to Korea, the other had to be notified. So they informed Japan they were sending 2,000 troops to Incheon. The Japanese leaders, having bitterly remembered what occurred the last time, when they had sent a smaller force into Korea, did not make the same mistake this time. Within just mere hours of receiving the notification, they dispatched 8,000 troops to Korea and notified China of this. Now, the other narrative has it that on June the 2nd, the Japanese cabinet decided to deploy troops to Korea, should China do so. On June the 3rd, King Gojong, under advice of Empress Min and Yuan Shikai, requested the Qing aid them. In doing so, he gave Japan the rationale to deploy their own troops, however. Thus, on June the 5th, the first imperial headquarters were established, and the next day, the ministries of the IGA and the IGN instructed the Japanese press to not print any information concerning warlike operations. China notified Japan on June the 7th of their developments, and within hours, the Japanese sent their notifications for the same. There is evidence. Many Japanese leaders accused China of not sending the notification, thus breaching the Treaty of Tianjin. But it seems highly likely they did in fact send the notification. Regardless, what is a fact is that Japan had already been pre-planning its deployment during the end of May. Thus, it all seemed a likely rationale to start a conflict. And this conflict would change the balance of power in Asia and begin a feud between two nations that still burn strongly to this very day. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there, you can find a 2-part series on the First Sino-Japanese War, with all the visuals you could ever desire. Also, just a friendly reminder, I now myself have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And this month's exclusive podcast over there is part 2 on my series about General Kanji Ishiwara, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident and the author behind the Final War Theory. Please check it out, it would mean a lot to me. The endless conflicts between China, Japan, and Little Korea had finally sprung a large-scale war, one that would change the balance of power in the East forever. Little brother was going to fight Big Brother.